180 in Southeast Ohio crew. We're coming to you live from our individual stay-at-home locations.
That's
Chad
right.
and I are here. So I'm Christy Spader, a team leader with crew here in Southeast Ohio. Chad, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Chad Helmer. I'm here at my home, and we're both under self-quarantine, right? This is the sort of stay-at-home order from the governor, and so we would have very much liked to have recorded this in the same space, but here we are.
Yeah, but we're in Athens, so we are in the same location. Wishing that we could be here with so many of you guys. I think it's just killing us knowing that it's Thursday night. We should be anticipating what is the 180, but here we are sitting in our houses in our respective locations, divided by a screen. So we're sad and we miss all of you and wish you were here with us. But this is our second best option. We'll say we are, as you may have heard, and as you're tuning in, you probably know this by now, but we are kicking it with the King, as this series is called. We're looking at the Psalms, and we're kind of following along with the 2016 Linger Conference and a few different speakers that have some of the student leaders have chosen for us. And really what we're doing today is we got a chance, hopefully you've already gotten a chance to watch Eric Mason's sermon on Psalm 23, but we got to listen to it. And so Chad and I wanted to take some time and kind of address a few of the questions that a few of the student leaders had for us and for you guys and for us, and just kind of dialogue about this message.
Yeah, it was incredible. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it, even if you're listening to us and you haven't heard it yet, it's worth going back and listening to. It's on YouTube. Even if you don't have much time, you can listen to it at 1.5 or whatever that option is to speed it up. But absolutely incredible message where Eric Mason, coming out of Psalm 23, perhaps the most famous psalm, people who don't go to church, people who do not have a relationship with the Lord, even if they don't, they might know Psalm 23. It's so embedded in our history. You often hear it repeated at funerals, and often it's shared. Even Governor DeWine tweeted it out just about a week ago as a reminder that—
No way, he did?
Yes, that's right, he did. So,
way to go, Governor.
That's right. So he
to the word. Even he wants us to linger.
It's true. It's true. So it's one of those passages that people turn to in really difficult and even really unique times like we're in right now. Yeah. And so I'll just quickly summarize some of what Eric shared in his sermon, and then Christy, you can help me fill in all the things I probably miss here. But he talked about how we have such a longing for autonomy, that we want to reject authority. But part of what we find in Psalm 23 is King David, and that's important, King David, a man who's a king, not bossing up, but bossing down, really submitting himself under the authority of a shepherd and being reminded that God is his shepherd. And so this is a picture in Psalm 23 of a leader who's being led, he says. And he just walks through 4 points, and the last two he even breezed through very quickly. I think he was short on time. But the first point, he talks about how the Lord provides relationship. And he reflects on this covenant relationship that we have that's unique. In some ways, it's not unique in that God has this relationship with people who enter into covenant with him, but yet at the same time, it's personalized, he says. It's a personalized relationship with the Lord as he shepherds not just his people, but he also shepherds me as an individual sheep. And so he talked about the Lord providing relationship, but then he also talked about the Lord providing replenishment and rest, and talked about pausing and taking advantage of the rest that God provides. And I really connected with this part of the sermon because he talked about how we just have a hunger for noise. We have these voracious appetites. What was the phrase he said you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, he used the metaphor of we're like toddlers on steroids. We always want on-the-go workouts, on-the-go TV, on-the-go food, just constantly moving and active and wanting more and more.
Yeah, so this hyperactive picture of just being insatiable. And so, but he talks about it's just sitting and lingering with God, that he leads us beside quiet waters. He restores our soul, just sitting with him. And the result is that we really are restored. The result is that God works through me, that the shepherd works through me. And he talks about leading us in paths of righteousness rather than the dysfunction that we're so prone toward.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the third point, he talked about how the Lord provides reassurance. And this is the imagery I think that people that draw people to this psalm so often is it's the imagery of the valley of the shadow of death. That even in these dark and challenging circumstances that people find themselves in, that God is with us. He shepherds us even in the midst of that. And then the fourth point he briefly just passed over is that the Lord provides recompense. And he talked about how goodness and mercy stalk us. And I love that imagery, that God chases after me. That he wants, it's not just me pursuing God. It's not that I pursue God, but from the very beginning, God has been one who's pursued me.
Even that visual I loved of like, the verb like chase. It's not just he's like walking after me or like looking for me. He's like, no, he's chasing. He's running after you. I loved that. It was a good message.
Yeah. So that's a quick summary of just these 4 points, but it was so rich in illustration, so rich in application. And those of you who are watching, you'll find we're following the discussion questions that are posted right at crew@ou.org. Under the Eric Mason sermon there and upcoming events. And so you can find that on the event calendar. You can find these discussion questions. But we're going to take a few minutes and talk about what we learned and what we took away from the sermon and anything that maybe stood out to us.
And we hope you guys are getting a chance to kind of engage other people about it. Maybe people in your Bible study or your action groups or even in times if you're connecting with a discipler during this season, like these are great things to talk about. This sermon was awesome. So really highly recommend. It feels so, I was listening to it and I was just sitting, I was bored and just was sitting and thinking how prevalent and relevant this is for our present circumstances and where we are right now. Like the big idea, just take time and be with God. This really significant theme for us to be thinking about. So maybe from that we can hop into the questions. You good with that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so question number 1 was, what are things that take away from your time with the Lord?
Yeah, I mean, as I thought about this, I had some that jumped out at me right away. And normally, I mean, I have a pretty established routine of spending time with the Lord each morning. And there are some days where that does feel really easy. It just feels part of my routine where I sit down and just spend time with him. But there are also times where I feel the pull. I feel the gravity, sort of pulling me away from that. And it's usually the same two culprits. It's usually the news. Sometimes I think I have an unhealthy addiction to the news. I'm just always interested in current events. It's often global news. Sometimes it's local news here in Athens. Often it's economic news. And of course, with all of this, the information that's coming out just, hourly about the coronavirus, I wake up and I think, oh my goodness, I wonder what's new today. And so, which really, really, I mean, I think about the language that Eric used of, this insatiable or voracious appetite that we have. And I just think it's a sad distraction because it's such an insufficient, it's such insufficient nourishment for my soul. It's just not going to give me what I need for the day, but yet there's something dysfunctional that I wake up craving it sometimes. And then I think the other thing that I think, and maybe people have different opinions about this, but I just often feel the distraction of wanting to read other books, not necessarily in substitute for, but other books beside my Bible that then inevitably put my Bible at the end of the line of things I want to read that day that then maybe I don't get to. So it's more about a prioritization issue, but I find myself distracted by other things I want to read. So yeah, they're pretty common temptations that pull me away from my normal routine with the Lord. But what about you?
Yeah, that's good. I definitely relate. I have been using this phrase a lot we've been using it in our house, I would say, Emily and I, inertia was very significant for us. Just the inertia of that gravitational pull, like you were talking about, the desire to just lay in my bed just a little bit longer in the morning ends up where I'm no longer have time to spend time with the Lord when I wake up, or as I'm going to bed and still haven't spent time with the Lord. That usually it's my bed that really pulls me away. But other comforts I think about, like just the my to-do list, the immediate and the present grab my attention. So I like see a friend calling on the phone that I like haven't talked to in a while, or text messages of like, hey, can you do this for me real quick? Or hey, what do you think about this? And immediately, even during the sermon, it was so sad. And the whole sermon about lingering, and I would get a text message and I'd and distract myself, and I missed a whole question because I was so distracted by my phone even while we were watching the sermon. So it feels like, what things take away? Oh, my phone, my ever not going away to-do list, of the present things in my life, people that I like want to care for, and my bed. Really. So sleeping.
That's great.
But, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
It's true. I think I'd probably be more tempted to sleep in if I didn't have a toddler.
Yes, that makes sense.
Who is up early each morning.
But. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe hop in for number 2, see what we get. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go back to it. So this one says, during times of uncertainty, which feels really relevant for where we're at, where do you see opportunities to lay down in green pastures with God?
Yeah, this is interesting. Yeah, I mean, my general impression, and I know it's not true for everyone, but my general impression is that because of the stay-at-home order, because of this new reality that we're living in light of the coronavirus, that people tend to have more time on their hands. And I'm sure it's not true for everyone, but I think one of the dangers of that is that then we have these amorphous kind of blocks of time that aren't structured or aren't scheduled. And I think it can be easy to then have no structure or no schedule at all. But I think there's such an incredible opportunity to create structure in a way where we actually get to spend more time with the Lord because of this. And here's what it reminds me of. You'll relate to this more than most because you've been to Israel more often than I have. But I remember being in Israel on the Sabbath, on the Shabbat, and I did something that was so, in hindsight, I wouldn't have done it. But culturally, my wife and I, we were there. We did not have anything to eat. We were living in an Airbnb, but we hadn't bought groceries. And so we were out on the Shabbat looking for an open restaurant. Now, here's what's incredible, is that the entire city of Jerusalem, you know this, shuts down, and it looks a lot like Athens does right now. In fact, it's more shut down than Athens is right now. And we looked forever to find. We finally did find an open restaurant, and a funny story actually, because as we were eating there, some ultra-Orthodox Jews came through and shamed all of us for eating and having a restaurant open on the Shabbat. But I think about it. I think about the Sabbath. In that kind of Sabbath observance, that there's a moment where there's actually a structured rest. It's a planned, scheduled, structured rest where the whole city shuts down in ways that are deferential to God and who he is and the way he's created the universe. And I love that. And so it's almost as though we're enduring this national or at least a statewide Sabbath at the moment. And I think whether we use it for structured time to connect with the Lord and to worship him, or whether we just sort of treat it like this amorphous, unstructured blob that we don't really get to do anything with, I think is going to make a big difference. So I think there's a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, for sure. My word, I've been kind of coming up with like words to define this season. And it's simplicity, but then my second one is rhythm. And okay. I think for me, it's been there is a little bit more time and space in my schedule because of this. And how am I actively, intentionally creating rhythms that are going to point me towards Christ as opposed to lead me away from Christ? And the reality is I feel like we're all at this crossroads of like, we have to be intentional about creating those rhythms to point us to Christ if we want to go that direction. Otherwise, inertia is a very real thing. And I think it's more than just house or me and Emily in this space that struggle with inertia. I think the world and the countless distractions pull us away. But I think there is opportunity in lingering a bit longer with the Lord. I think another thing for me that's really stood out, I loved that the initial part of this question said during times of uncertainty. And I just feel the uncertainty around us right now. I feel it in terms of like the health of my parents, the health of my friends. I found out a friend might have it out in Oregon, and it's causes some anxiety and uncertainty, even in my own inner world. I think about financially, some of the reality was entertaining buying a house someday. And so what does this mean for that? Or my job, or just all of the countless unknowns of the future, I think weigh on me in times like this. And so even where do I see opportunity with this? Well, I think when I go and I linger with the Lord, when I spend time with him, and create some of those rhythms, I think it's a really sweet, there's opportunities for the Lord to remind me of his character and his faithfulness, and for me to lie down in green pastures and him to kind of cover me with his character in a beautiful way, to really reassure me with who he is. And so I think for me, there's an opportunity to trust God, and an opportunity for me to get a glimpse of who he is through this, as I lie down in green pastures with him.
That's great. That's awesome. Yeah, it's so true that there's something about our resting, I think, that reveals God's shepherd-like nature. You know what I mean? That when we don't take advantage of the rest, when we don't take advantage of what he provides, we miss the blessing of it, obviously. But we also miss something of who God is what I hear you saying, when we don't do that. So I think that's
we're constantly looking around, which kind of goes into our next question.
We're
looking around in the midst of uncertainty for things to help fill us or solve the problems or engage what's going on in me. And so we turn to these other things instead of, as we lie down him, as he leads us to lie green pastures, we get a glimpse of who he is. That kind of transitions us into this next question. So let's, Eric Mason actually give this really good illustration about when you taking your car to the place. Do you want to describe what that was for us?
Yeah, it was such a great story. I mean, he talks about how a friend of, he needed some work done on his car. And this was a time when financially things were really lean for he and his wife. Financially, they just didn't have money.
Accentuated that. Leaner than, what was it, like bologna or leaner
filet
than
mignon. Yeah, it was, yeah, they didn't have any fat to spare.
Mignon.
Yeah, they had no fat to spare, so they had no extra money. So they did the cheap option, and and a friend said, hey, your car needs some work. Let's take it to the guy down. I know a guy. You could take it to him. And he took it to this guy and charged him $100, but absolutely destroyed his car. I mean, made matters far worse, to the point he finally did have to break down and take it to the dealer, that expensive place that you don't normally want to go because they're going to charge you a lot more money. And he said, we didn't have the money to take it to the dealer. But he highlighted the way that by taking his car to the wrong place, it actually made things worse. And the punchline that I thought was so good was, why do you take your soul elsewhere than the manufacturer? Why wouldn't you take your soul to the manufacturer of your soul? You know the difference. So talking about the difference between where you take your soul and which really stings. And I think, you can answer this question at some really different levels, because really the discussion question is, when have you taken your soul somewhere other than God, and what was the result? So you want to take that one first, or I could take it?
Sure, I can hop in. I can think of a lot of different times, and so there's layers of vulnerability here in this. So I'm gonna dive in deep for us. But I particularly times really stand out to me when I remember looking back on my life, where I just definitely found myself, my soul was a wire and I took it elsewhere. And so I remember, I can think about high school a lot of times when I would be lonely or sad, instead of spending time and turning to the Lord, I turned to relationships, and I turned to both friendships for affirmation of who I was and that I belonged or that I fit in. I turned to alcohol to fit in and to feel like my identity was secure. But I also turned even I remember at different points in my life, like when I would feel sad at night, I'd like text a couple of guy friends and be like, "What are you doing?" and kind of flirt. And this was very much, I was looking for something from those people that my soul was hungry for. And really what it needed was the Lord to remind me who I was and my identity. But I chose to find it in this world and people. And I mean, that carried on, I think, in college. And there was this probably one of the most significant points in my life, really defining moment for me, where I felt like I was at a crossroad of just deciding, and I made a really poor decision, and the Lord really used it in my life. And so I remember I was a sophomore in college, and I had been given a take-home exam, and it was 50% of my grade. And I wanted to do well in this class, this desire for success and achievement. And I had studied really hard, and I still felt like I was not doing well. And so I remember sitting in my dorm room, and I saw the book right next to me of where I could open it up, and I knew what page is on. I could almost visualize where it was, where the answers were that I was looking for. And I made the decision to cheat on that exam at 50% of my grade. And I remember for the next week, it just ate me alive, that my integrity was compromised, that I had gone somewhere else for what I was looking for, and it left me. And the question asked about, like, what was the result? It left me miserable. I don't think I've ever been so miserable in my life. I had dreams about that test. We had chapel at the school I went to, and I like couldn't sing to God. I like felt conviction in my heart that I just, it was going to potentially cost 50% of my needed class, that I would class, potentially keep me back an entire year of school because of requisites. And I had to make a decision whether I would be willing to go to the professor or not. And I just couldn't deal with it. I like felt the Lord saying, you need to be honest about this. And so I ended up knocking on that professor's door, and he opened up, just wept in front of him. By God's grace, he was incredibly gracious. I knew I wasn't entitled to that, but I got to experience a lot of God's grace through that. But saw myself really at a choice, and my soul went the wrong direction, but got to experience how in honesty and integrity, even when it's hard and even when I messed up, is always the right deciin.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for sharing that one with me and with YouTube. And I mean, what I had written down as I was thinking about it wasn't nearly that vulnerable or profound, but I was just aware of all the things during the day that I think I turned to for life rather than the manufacturer. You know what I mean? And I think it's, you've talked about this. I feel like I've learned a lot from you about this, talking about drift. And
say that one more time.
Yes, drift. This idea of the way we just sort of drift away from God. Yeah. It just happens, and it happens throughout my day. And so, so I don't have anything as deep or profound. But I was thinking about the distractions in my day. Really, they're distractions, but I think they're going to give me life. It's the things that it's checking my Twitter feed. It's checking the news. It's checking the stock market. It's these sorts of things that I look to that I'm hoping for. Psychologists have talked about the way social media does this. We want that drip of dopamine, just that little injection of oh, that's exciting, or oh, that's fun. Sometimes it's shopping for something, a deal or something I'm looking for. And those things aren't necessarily bad in themselves, but I just find that I go to them for life. I'm somehow in my dysfunction, I've been wired to look to them to give me something that they're not going to give me. And the result is that I always feel either more tired, not rested, or I feel more dysfunctional, or I don't feel restored in my soul. So much of this is about being restored in our soul and turning to the manufacturer, turning to the shepherd of our soul. And they just don't, they're fun, they're distractions, they're games, all sorts of things like that. They're distractions, but they don't leave me feeling restored. They don't leave me feeling refreshed. Often I feel even more drained than before.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it goes to show there's really pivotal moments and decisions that we make to turn actively towards things in one way or another. I think about like bigger decisions we can make about what are we going to do with that, our relationship, in terms of purity, or how do we spend my time, or a decision to cheat or not cheat on exam. But then there's also the day-to-day drifting of our soul that can happen, and it's usually a lot more gradual increase, or gradual turning away, but it's no less significant where our soul is turning to things that are the true manufacturer, or what we actually need.
That's really good. I feel like if we had more time, you and I could spend some time talking about how our hearts are wired to love, and how we are what we love. And so, but I know we don't have time to go into that right
It's
now.
so good. We can keep going. Awesome. Well, let's hit this last question if you're up for it. So this last question is, when have you found God comforting you with his staff? So we talked about his rod and his staff, they comfort you. And so even he gave some illustrations. Actually, do you want to describe what those were about? Or just how he talked about sheep and what the rod and staff actually do for the sheep?
Yeah, let's tag team it, because the one that I was a little more tuned into was, the way that the shepherd wants to kind of keep us on the path of righteousness, in that sort of prodding or poking that sends us in one direction or another, so that we don't veer off of the path of righteousness. And I think part of what was helpful,
this rod that's keeping them along this path.
Yes. And I think for me, the thing that stood out about what he said, and I don't know that this is a great answer to the question, but it just gave me pause, and I started to think about it. That Eric said, you don't know how much, sometimes you're prone to think about what God has allowed to happen in your life, but you don't realize how much he's spared you from. You don't understand how his rod and his correction of you has spared you from the kinds of things that would happen if you deviated from the path of righteousness. And so sometimes you think about, well, what, we just don't know. We just don't know what else could have been had God not corrected us or pointed us in a particular direction. And I could think of all kinds of times when I prayed for something and didn't get what I wanted, or there was a time where I was really hoping for something and it didn't turn out. I can think about where just other things that have happened, other people's decisions, and I've been impacted by them, and it's felt unfair and wrong and difficult sometimes. But even in that, I don't know what God was sparing me from, as I've been sort of prodded, into the path of righteousness.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I really liked, he talked a lot about, gave a quote talked about how in the valley of the shadow of death, so this place where places where we can't see, or the sheep can't see, that this is where the rod and staff comfort you or comfort me. And so just thinking about, he even talked about how the sheep can't see, and so he kind of taps them to reminds them of his protection and his whereabouts. It really made me think of C.S. Lewis when he talks about, there's a place in Screwtape Letters where he talks about God's presence is always with us, but every once in a while he turns ever slightly towards us so that we just feel this overwhelming sense of his presence with us and protecting us and caring. And then every once in a while he turns, now I don't think this is necessarily true about how God's interacting with us, so don't hear me saying that, but there's moments where he ever so slightly turns away, and it just feels like light years of difference, and yet he's always there protecting us and guiding us along the way. And so when have I felt those times? I mean, it's daily decisions that I've made. It's sparing me from, I think there's been moments where I've started to veer down different paths, and he's used people in my life to point me back to himself. I think about men and women, friendships that he's allowed my life to point out sin in my life that have allowed me to experience his comfort or his rod in gracious ways. And even there's been moments when, like, I think about that exam, where I experienced, that teacher showed me that God's rod of correction, and but I got to experience the grace of sometimes discipline that hurts and is painful. That's discipline. It's actually it's so comforting because it's kept me on the paths of righteousness, which ultimately we know brings the joy in our walk with the Lord, that when we walk righteously and obediently with him, it's the path of the greatest life. He leads us for his name's sake and for his glory, but our joy as well in his presence. And so I think about things like that. Anything you'd add, or does that
No, I think that's great. And especially, I mean, thinking about the shepherd in light of what we know about God's presence, I think it's a great way to think about it. So,
yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
And
I mean, maybe just to summarize, I wrote down at minute 31. I loved it. He had this beautiful summary, and I wrote it down. So I was like,
let's hear it.
He talks about when we don't kick the shepherd, we'll stay dysfunctional. And when dysfunctional, we make dumb decisions and we go stupid places. He says it so much more profoundly than I do. When we spend time with the shepherd, we're allowed for the shepherd to nourish us, to feed us, to strengthen us, to give us his grace and protect us. And then we begin to see things differently, and he restores our soul. And in that, when we're out it leads us on paths of righteousness, and we're able to discern good and evil. And this all comes from being with him. And so his whole summary of this was, why do we sometimes make bad decisions? Because he leads us to say, we want to linger with him. We want to spend time with the Lord, that he's truly bringing us to the paths of righteousness and his presence. The psalmist enjoys being with God, and that's what matters most.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. A fitting way to end. And so we'll be doing this each week for 180. You can find next week's sermon online at crew@ou.org, and just scroll down to where it says upcoming events, and you'll see that. We'll also have this posted there, and previous weeks posted on the event calendar. You can go back, listen to those sermons, look at those discussion questions, and we'll have this on our podcast as well. And so we are grateful that you joined us. Wish we could be together under other circumstances, but for the time being, we'll be here and be meeting with you this way. And we'll be praying for you, hoping that you linger with the Lord, hoping that you experience him as your shepherd during this time. So thanks for joining us. Anything you want to add, Christy?
Nope, that's it. We'll see you later, 180.
All right. Bye, 180.